He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, just sat there, sleeve rolled up, letting the young VA doctor check his vitals. Until the doctor glanced at the scarred tattoo on his arm and smirked. "You vets love those biker tats, huh?" That wasn't a biker tattoo. It was a purple heart, inked over the exact spot the shrapnel went in. The room fell quiet. Master Sergeant Leon Carter didn't say a word. But 5 minutes later, someone else did. Because the VA director walked in, took one look at him, and saluted, loud, clear, and in front of everyone. That moment, it changed more than just a conversation. Subscribe for the full story, and drop a comment, because this one will stay with you. The waiting room at the Birmingham VA outpatient clinic had that particular stillness that comes with rain against windows and people lost in their own thoughts. It was just past 2 on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of grey October day where the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer than usual and the worn vinyl chairs held the weight of too many stories. Master Sergeant Leon Carter sat in the corner by the window, his weathered hands folded carefully over a manila folder containing 24 years of military medical records. At 68, he looked like the kind of man you might pass on the street without noticing. Soft brown eyes behind, wire-rimmed glasses, scuffed work boots that had seen better decades, a faded Marine Corps ball cap pulled low over graying temples. His flannel shirt was rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms marked by age spots and surgical scars, and there on his right arm, just below the elbow, a tattoo that most people wouldn't recognize at first glance. A heart-shaped medal rendered in purple ink, clean lines, simple design, but the skin around it told a different story. The flesh was puckered and discolored, melted-looking in places where shrapnel had torn through muscle and sinew on a rooftop in Fallujah. That wasn't just ink on his arm. That was the exact spot where Leon had taken enemy fire while dragging a wounded corpsman to safety, refusing to leave his position until every Marine in his squad was accounted for. The tattoo artist in Camp Pendleton had been a former Navy corpsman himself, and he'd worked carefully around the scar tissue, understanding what he was marking. This wasn't decoration, it was commemoration, a purple heart inked over the wound that earned it, because Leon had lost the actual medal somewhere in the chaos of medical evacuation and multiple surgeries, and by the time he was coherent enough to ask about it, there were bigger things to worry about. Leon had served 6 deployments across 3 different conflicts, collected enough commendations to fill a shadow box, and earned the kind of respect that comes from never asking anyone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. But retirement hadn't been the peaceful transition everyone promised. The nightmares still came, the hypervigilance never really faded, and the VA was supposed to be where soldiers like him could find some measure of understanding, some recognition, that the scars they carried, visible and invisible, meant something. He'd been coming to this clinic for 3 years now, ever since moving to Birmingham to be closer to his daughter after his wife passed. The routine appointments had become a kind of anchor in his week. Blood pressure checks, medication reviews, brief conversations with doctors who usually understood that when a combat veteran said he was doing fine, it meant he was functioning, not flourishing. Today was supposed to be simple. A follow-up on some arthritis medication, maybe a discussion about the pinched nerve in his shoulder that still flared up when the weather changed. Leon had arrived 15 minutes early, as was his habit, and settled into his usual spot where he could see both exits and keep his back to the wall. Old habits. The sound of his name being called cut through the ambient hum of the waiting room. Leon Carter? A young man in a white coat stood at the doorway to the exam area, tablet in one hand, wireless earbuds dangling from his neck like jewelry. Dr. Marcus Webb, according to his name tag. Fresh-faced, maybe 28, with the kind of confident posture that comes from graduating medical school with honors and landing your first real job. Leon rose slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, and followed the doctor down. A hallway lined with motivational posters about mental health and addiction recovery. The exam room was standard VA issue. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a computer workstation that looked like it belonged in a 1990s office building. "Let's make this quick, okay?" Dr. Webb said without looking up from his tablet. "I've got 7 more patients before 5. Leon nodded politely and took his place on the examination table, the paper crinkling under his weight. He'd been called "Sir" by generals and grunts alike during his military career, and he didn't mind informal, as long as there was basic respect. The young doctor moved with efficient energy, checking Leon's blood pressure, listening to his heart, typing notes with the rapid-fire clicking of someone who'd learned to think in abbreviated medical terminology. It was when Dr. Webb wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Leon's arm that he first noticed the tattoo. He paused, his attention caught by the purple heart-shaped design wrapped around the scarred tissue, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't know bikers came in for PTSD meds," he said with a chuckle, his tone carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone who thought he was being clever. Leon looked up, his expression unchanged, but something shifting behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," Dr. Webb gestured at the tattoo with his pen, still smiling. "That's a biker thing, right? Skull and heart stuff? Don't see many guys your age getting new ink. What's next? A Harley-Davidson logo on your shoulder?" Leon didn't respond. Immediately, he could have explained that the Purple Heart is awarded to service members wounded or killed in combat. Could have mentioned that his had been presented to him in a field hospital tent while a surgeon worked to repair the severed artery in his shoulder. Could have described the 3 days he'd spent under enemy fire, refusing medical evacuation because 2 of his Marines were still pinned down in a bombed-out building across the street. Instead, he just stared, quiet, unreadable, his hands folded carefully in his lap. Dr. Webb continued with the examination, oblivious to the weight of his words. He typed more notes, checked Leon's reflexes, asked perfunctory questions about sleep patterns and anxiety levels. In the hallway outside, a nurse named Patricia Morrison paused in her rounds. She'd overheard the comment about bikers and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Patricia had been working at this clinic for 12 years. She'd seen Leon Carter before, knew he came in every few months, always courteous, always early, always alone, and she'd noticed things that apparently Dr. Webb had missed. The way Leon automatically scanned every room when he entered, the careful way he positioned himself near exits, the fact that his folder was twice as thick as most patients and marked with service-connected disability codes, but Leon wasn't going to argue. That wasn't his style. He'd survived worse than ignorance, worse than disrespect. He sat still and steady, holding on to his silence like it was his last piece of dignity. What neither the doctor nor Leon knew was that someone very important was already en route to the clinic, and they weren't coming for a routine inspection. The examination continued in that sterile, fluorescent-lit room, while rain continued to streak the windows outside. Leon remained motionless as Dr. Webb made small talk about traffic, the weather, his long day. But something had changed in the atmosphere, the kind of subtle shift that happens when someone is holding back more than they should. Then it got worse. Dr. Webb, glancing again at the old shrapnel scars as he reviewed Leon's medical history on his tablet, shook his head with the weary expression of someone who thought he'd seen it all. "You know, I see guys with PTSD claims all the time," he muttered more to himself than to Leon. "Can't always tell what's real anymore. Some of them just want the meds." He wasn't even talking to Leon directly, just thinking out loud as if the man sitting 3 feet away was a case study rather than a human being. Leon's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, not clenched, just repositioned the way a Marine does when he's processing the weight of what not to say. Dr. Webb looked up from his tablet and actually chuckled, a sound that seemed to echo off the sterile walls. That tattoo really threw me off earlier. Purple Heart, right? Or just a tribute piece? I mean, you can get anything online these days." Leon's response came quietly, barely above a whisper, but with the kind of controlled precision that comes from decades of military bearing. "It was earned." The words hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot. Dr. Webb didn't pick up on the tone. He raised his eyebrows with the skeptical expression of someone who'd heard too many stories and believed too few of them. "Well, hey, it looks legit. I mean, if it were real, that'd be pretty serious, right? Those don't just get handed out for showing up." Leon didn't answer. He didn't owe this young doctor the story of Fallujah. Didn't owe him the memory of 19-year-old Corporal Martinez screaming into a radio while Leon held a field dressing against his own torn shoulder with one hand and applied pressure to the corpsman's sucking chest wound with the other. Didn't owe him the sound of incoming mortars or the weight of knowing that moving from that position would mean abandoning wounded Marines. He didn't owe any of it. But something was shifting in the hallway outside. Patricia Morrison had made a decision not to call HR or the clinic director or patient relations. She'd made a call to someone higher up the chain of command, someone who needed to know that a decorated veteran was being dismissed and disrespected in a federal facility designed to serve him. It just so happened that Birmingham's VA regional director, a decorated Army colonel turned executive named Dana Lister, was already driving toward the clinic for an unannounced facility review. She was 5 minutes away when her phone rang. In the exam room, Dr. Webb had just handed Leon a new prescription, one for an anti-anxiety medication that Leon hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. The doctor tapped his pen against the clipboard with the impatient rhythm of someone ready to move on to the next appointment. "Just give it a try," he said, with the casual authority of someone who'd never spent a sleepless night wondering if every sound outside meant danger. "You vets usually respond well to this stuff. Helps with the hypervigilance, the jumping at loud noises, all that." Leon looked at the prescription slip quietly, folded it with careful precision, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. His hands were steadier than they'd been all day, but something in his posture made Patricia Morrison, who was now standing just outside the doorway, think of a soldier preparing for contact. Down the hall, the elevator chimed. A set of polished shoes clicked across the tile floor with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Regional Director Dana Lister walked through the main entrance of the clinic, her sharp eyes scanning the waiting area with the automatic assessment of a leader who'd spent years managing both facilities and crises. She was 47 years old, silver-haired, wearing a navy blue suit with 4 rows of service ribbons on her chest. A woman who'd commanded supply convoys in Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian leadership in the VA system. She didn't wait for a staff greeting or check. In with the front desk, she was already asking Patricia Morrison, "Where is Master Sergeant Carter?" because she'd known Leon would be here today, not just from Patricia's urgent phone call, but from her own records. Leon Carter wasn't just any veteran filing routine claims or requesting standard care. He was on her personal radar, a man who'd refused full disability compensation to leave space for someone who needs it more, who'd never once complained about wait times or administrative delays, who represented the kind of quiet integrity that the VA system was meant to serve, but too often took for granted. As Director Lister turned the corner into the examination hallway, she could hear voices from room 7. One belonged to a man she recognized from his file photo. Calm, controlled, speaking in measured tones. The other belonged to someone who was still talking, still explaining, still demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was dealing with. "Some of these trauma cases," Dr. Webb was saying as she approached the partially open door, They kind of exaggerate over time. Like, I'm not saying you're lying, but memory's tricky, you know. Sometimes people convince themselves things were worse than they actually were. Director Lister didn't knock. She stepped into the doorway, positioned herself between the young doctor and the veteran, and spoke one sentence that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Dr. Webb stammered, blinking at her. Credentials and the sudden shift in authority that had just walked into his examination room. Leon simply nodded once, respectfully, the way one service member acknowledges another. Director Lister returned the nod, then turned back to Leon. In front of the young physician who'd just spent 20 minutes questioning a war hero's integrity, she stood at attention and rendered a crisp, formal salute. "On behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs and the country you bled for, thank you for your service, Master Sergeant." The silence that followed could have been measured in heartbeats or geological ages. Time seemed to pause while the full weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Dr. Webb stood frozen between his own ignorance and the crushing realization that he hadn't been correcting a fraud or catching an exaggerator. He'd just spent the better part of an hour humiliating a genuine war hero, questioning the authenticity of wounds that had been earned in combat and authenticated by military medical personnel. Leon slowly returned the salute, his hand rising, with the precise movements of decades past, steady despite his age, and the tremor that sometimes came from old nerve damage. When he lowered his arm, something fundamental had shifted in the room, not just the power dynamic, but the very nature of respect itself. Director Lister's voice carried the tone of someone used to briefing commanding officers and dressing down subordinates who failed to meet standards. "You don't get to question this man's integrity," she said, her words cutting through the sterile air like a blade. "Not when he's earned recognition you can't even properly identify, let alone understand." "Doctor." Webb opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say. No explanation that could undo the damage, no apology that could restore what had been torn down. Director Lister stepped back into the hallway and made one phone call, brief, professional, devastating. "We have a situation," she said to her. "Deputy Regional Administrator. HIPAA compliant, but flag it immediately. A Purple Heart recipient was mocked and dismissed in a federal facility. The attending physician demonstrated fundamental ignorance of both protocol and law. I want his supervisor here in 15 minutes. Start the internal review process now." Inside the exam room, Dr. Webb's entire demeanor had collapsed. His shoulders hunched inward, his confident posture replaced by the defeated stance of someone who'd just learned the difference between medical knowledge and wisdom. He muttered something about misunderstanding and not having all the information, but even he knew the words were empty, because it wasn't just about Leon anymore. A few minutes later, the clinic's chief of medicine arrived, Dr. Harold Pemberton, a silver-haired man with 30 years of VA experience and the kind of weathered face that comes from seeing too much human suffering. He took one look at the situation, pulled Dr. Webb out of the room without a word, and closed the door behind them. For the first time that day, Leon exhaled completely. He leaned back against the examination table and allowed himself to feel something other than controlled restraint. Not pride or vindication or triumph, just the simple relief of being seen, of being recognized, of having his service acknowledged by someone who understood its weight. Director Lister remained behind, not to lecture or investigate further, but to sit in the chair beside Leon's examination table. Her voice softened with the kind of respect that passes between veterans who've walked similar paths. "Master Sergeant, I'm deeply sorry this happened to you today." Leon shook his head slowly. "It's not just me, ma'am. Happens more than people think." "I know," she said quietly. That's exactly what I'm working to change. She explained that in the past 6 months, there had been more than a dozen formal complaints filed by veterans who were dismissed, disrespected, or misdiagnosed by VA physicians. Too young or too inexperienced to recognize what decades of trauma actually looked like. Most of those complaints never made it to senior leadership, buried in administrative processes or dismissed as isolated incidents. But this one would be different. Word spread through the clinic with the kind of quiet efficiency that characterizes both military operations and hospital gossip. By the time Leon and Director Lister emerged from the examination room, staff members were standing at attention throughout the hallway, not because protocol required it, but because they wanted to. A few nurses rendered respectful salutes. The front desk receptionist offered Leon her own chair. Someone had already brought fresh water for the service dog he didn't have with him that day, thinking ahead to his next visit. The very next morning, Director Lister issued a press release from the VA's regional office. We are initiating mandatory sensitivity training across all facilities in Alabama to ensure that veterans, especially those bearing visible and invisible wounds, are treated with the honor and respect they have earned through service. Dr. Webb was reassigned to administrative duties pending a full investigation. Within 72 hours, he'd submitted a transfer request to a civilian hospital system in another state. The official records would show administrative reassignment for additional training. The unofficial reality was that his career in veterans healthcare was effectively over. But the real change wasn't captured in press releases or personnel files. 2 weeks later, the Birmingham VA clinic held its first ever ceremony specifically honoring Vietnam veterans, something that had never happened in the facility's 40-year history. Leon was invited to speak, but he declined the microphone. Instead, he stood quietly at the back of the room in his dress blues, watching younger veterans, some missing limbs, some missing piece, as they received the recognition they'd been waiting decades to receive. When the ceremony ended, a young Marine with fresh scars and haunted eyes approached him. "Sir, I heard what happened. Thank you for not giving up on this place." Leon looked at the young man, 20-something desert camouflage still creased from recent deployment, and saw himself 40 years ago. "You don't give up on family," he said simply, "even when they don't recognize you right away." The Marine nodded and walked away, but Leon could see in his shoulders that something had been carried just a little bit lighter. A week after the incident, Leon received a formal written apology delivered personally by the clinic director. The letter came with a note from the VA secretary in Washington, thanking him for his continued service, not just in uniform, but in principle and example. Leon read the letter once, folded it carefully, and mailed it to Sarah Morrison in Mobile, the widow of a fellow Marine who died in the same VA system without ever hearing the words "thank you" or "we're sorry" or "your service mattered." "He earned this more than I did," Leon told the postal clerk when he sent the package. As for Dr. Webb, he never returned to any VA facility. His medical license remained valid. His record showed no formal disciplinary action, but within the veteran community, word traveled with the kind of efficiency that comes from shared experience and mutual protection. He found work in a civilian emergency room 3 states away, where the patients didn't carry invisible wounds and the stakes felt somehow lower. The real transformation happened gradually, like most meaningful change. The clinic's waiting room acquired a new plaque, positioned directly under the American flag, in honor of the wounds we don't see. New signs appeared at intake stations. "Service animals welcome. If you're unsure, ask, don't assume." And perhaps most importantly, some scars are invisible. Respect goes further than you think. Leon noticed it all during his next appointment 6 weeks later. Same building, same vinyl chairs, completely different atmosphere. The receptionist greeted him by name, offered coffee without being asked, and had somehow arranged for a parking space near the entrance marked Combat Veterans. In the hallway, a young soldier with a tremor in his hands nodded as they passed each other, and Leon nodded back, a moment of recognition that required no words but conveyed everything. The new doctor assigned to Leon's case was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a 40-something woman with kind eyes and 20 years of military medicine behind her. She noticed the Purple Heart tattoo immediately, asked respectfully about the circumstances that led to it, and listened without interruption as Leon shared more of his story than he'd told anyone in years. That month, Leon received speaking invitations from 2 local high schools. The students didn't want war stories or tales of heroism. They wanted to understand respect, recognition, dignity, concepts that seemed increasingly rare in a world of social media reactions and instant judgments. Standing before a gymnasium full of teenagers, Leon told them something simple but profound. When someone carries more than they show, don't judge what you can't see. Ask questions, listen to answers, or just make space for the silence. A quiet girl in the front row raised her hand and asked why he'd never gotten angry that day in the clinic, why he hadn't fought back or demanded respect. Leon smiled for the first time in the telling of this story. Because I've seen real anger, real chaos, real hatred. That doctor, he wasn't evil. He just didn't know better. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is give someone the chance to learn who you really are. 3 months later, a handwritten note arrived at Leon's house with no return address. The envelope contained a short letter on plain paper. I was the medical student shadowing Dr. Webb that day. I didn't say anything when I should have. I've replayed that moment 100 times since, and I just wanted you to know I see it now. I see all of it. Thank you for not raising your voice. That taught me more than any textbook ever could. Leon kept that letter, folded it once with the same care he'd once used to fold the flag over his wife's casket, and tucked it into the old leather wallet he'd carried since 1975. By winter, Leon had become something of a quiet legend in Birmingham's, a veteran community. Not because he sought recognition or demanded special treatment, but because in one crucial moment, when he was disrespected, dismissed, and reduced to a stereotype, he'd maintained his dignity. He'd stood his ground without raising his voice, held his honor without demanding acknowledgement, and in doing so, reminded everyone present what true strength actually looks like. The story spread organically through the networks that connect veterans across generations and conflicts, not because Leon told it. He never spoke publicly about what happened, but because Patricia Morrison shared it with her husband, who mentioned it at the VFW, where it was overheard by a Vietnam veteran who posted about it online, where it was read by thousands of people who recognized something profound in the telling. Leon Carter walked out of that clinic that rainy Wednesday afternoon with a new prescription he didn't need, a follow-up appointment scheduled with appropriate respect, and something far more valuable than medical care, his dignity, not just restored, but recognized by people who understood its worth. He never posted about the incident on social media, never gave interviews to local news stations, never sought any form of public recognition. But across the entire VA network, new training protocols were implemented, not just about policies and procedures, but about people, about remembering who these men and women truly are and what their service cost them. Sometimes the quietest stand becomes the loudest reminder that the scars we carry weren't painted on for effect or chosen for aesthetics. They were earned in moments when courage mattered more than comfort, when duty superseded safety, when the mission required more than most people have to give. Leon Carter didn't need an audience to validate his service or a salute to confirm his worth. But that day, when both were offered freely by someone who understood their meaning, something fundamental was restored. not just to one man, but to the principle that honor recognizes honor, that respect flows naturally toward those who've earned it, and that sometimes the most powerful response to ignorance isn't anger or argument, but the simple, unshakable dignity of a warrior who knows exactly who he is and what he's done. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember what true respect looks like. Subscribe for more stories that honor the silent heroes walking among us every day. And in the comments below, tell us about a time you witnessed someone stand tall without saying a word. Because those moments matter more than we often realize, and they deserve to be remembered.